I didn't feel joyful. I was scared. I was afraid. And it wasn't anxiety. They were like panic attacks,
Yeah.
which are different.
Nobody expected this to come from Goldie Hawn. Not at 79. Not now. And definitely not with the kind of quiet fury that has Hollywood insiders scrambling and fans rethinking everything they thought they knew about the so-called golden age of cinema. Because when Goldie finally started talking, she didn't sound nostalgic. She sounded relieved. In recent resurfaced interviews and private conversations now being dissected online, Goldie has been dropping clues, not names, but warnings. Stories about intimidation disguised as charm, about cruelty hidden behind awards, about stars who smiled for cameras while destroying people behind closed doors. And the most chilling part, everyone who knows classic Hollywood says they already know exactly who she's talking about. 6 figures, 6 untouchable legends, 6 careers built on fear, control, and silence. Goldie didn't shout, she didn't rant. She calmly described environments where women were humiliated for sport, where careers vanished overnight, where no was never an acceptable answer. She talked about rooms going cold when certain stars walked in, about being warned, quietly, by crew members who were terrified of retaliation, about learning early that survival sometimes meant smiling and saying nothing. And once fans started connecting the dots, the internet exploded. Old interviews resurfaced. Blind items lined up perfectly. Other actresses' stories suddenly made sense. What once sounded like isolated complaints now looked like a pattern, a system designed to protect monsters as long as they were profitable. This isn't a nostalgic tell-all. It's a reckoning decades overdue. Because if Goldie Hawn is finally done protecting Hollywood's secrets, then the legends we grew up loving may never look the same again. By the time Goldie Hawn began speaking the way she does now, the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't revisionist history. This was someone finally unburdening herself of decades of restraint. According to people who have worked closely with her, Goldie reached a point where protecting Hollywood's illusions no longer felt noble. It felt dishonest. And the stories she began telling, softly and without theatrics, pulled back a curtain many wished would stay closed. She started by describing fear. Not the dramatic kind audiences see on screen, but the quiet fear that settles into hallways and dressing rooms. She spoke of learning very early which smiles were safe and which ones came with consequences. One particular male star, remembered publicly as warm, clever, and endlessly charming, was the first to teach her that lesson. Goldie described how his humor wasn't playful, it was weaponized. He would humiliate young actresses under the guise of jokes, correct them in front of crews, and then smile as if daring anyone to call it cruelty. At the time, people laughed because laughter was safer than resistance. Years later, other women would quietly admit they'd felt the same chill when he entered a room. Then, there was the man everyone called a genius. Goldie never used the word predator, but she didn't have to. She talked about warnings passed between women in whispers, about assistants subtly insisting doors remain open, about meetings that left actresses shaken, unsure whether they were imagining the discomfort or expected to endure it. This man's talent protected him. His brilliance excused his behavior. Careers flourished if you pleased him and mysteriously stalled if you didn't. Goldie learned that refusal in classic Hollywood wasn't just personal, it was professional suicide. She also spoke about a woman, which surprised many listeners. Not all power wore suits. This actress ruled her domain with icy precision. Goldie recalled sets where scripts seemed to change overnight, scenes quietly reassigned, and newcomers suddenly erased. There was no screaming, no tantrums. Just an understanding that this woman decided who belonged and who didn't. Goldie described her as someone who feared replacement more than failure and treated other women accordingly. Survival meant obedience, admiration, and silence. One of Goldie's most unsettling reflections centered on someone the public adored as wholesome and safe. A figure cast repeatedly as a father, a moral compass, a symbol of trust. Goldie admitted the realization hit her slowly. That kindness could be rehearsed. That generosity could be performative. She spoke about moments where boundaries were tested just enough to confuse, just enough to intimidate, never enough to expose. Years later, when other stories surfaced about that same man, people revisited Goldie's words and realized she had been signaling danger long before anyone wanted to hear it. Another figure she alluded to wasn't even a performer. This was a gatekeeper, a man whose office determined futures. Goldie talked about how he treated young talent like inventory, replaceable, disposable, One day you were praised as the next big thing, the next you were erased without explanation. No arguments, no second chances, just silence. The cruelty wasn't loud, it was bureaucratic, and that made it even more devastating. Entire careers disappeared without a single public scandal to explain why. As Goldie's reflections continued, a pattern emerged. These weren't isolated bad actors. They were protected by a system that rewarded results over humanity. Bad behavior was reframed as temperament. Abuse was rebranded as passion. Victims were labeled difficult. Goldie admitted that there were moments she considered leaving entirely, moments when she questioned whether success was worth the cost of navigating so much unchecked power. But she stayed. Not because it was easy, because she knew leaving wouldn't dismantle the system. What shook fans most was how calm she sounded recounting it all. No bitterness, no anger, just clarity. Goldie wasn't seeking revenge. She was documenting reality. She described how women learned to warn each other without leaving evidence, how men learned which lines could be crossed without consequences, how silence became currency. If you wanted longevity, you paid with your voice. As these stories resurfaced online, fans began connecting dots. Blind items suddenly made sense. Old interviews sounded different. What once seemed like eccentric behavior now read as entitlement. People started naming names in comment sections, arguing, denying, defending. Hollywood insiders, meanwhile, grew quiet, very quiet, because they recognized the accuracy of Goldie's descriptions, and they knew how many people those descriptions implicated. The most chilling part of Goldie's reflections wasn't what she said. It was what she implied. That the industry didn't just tolerate these figures, it depended on them. That success was often built atop fear, compliance, and complicity. That for every star who thrived, there were dozens who disappeared quietly, carrying stories no one wanted to hear. And then Goldie said something that made the room reportedly go still. She mentioned that there was one figure she had never spoken about publicly. Someone whose behavior was so normalized at the time that no one even questioned it. Someone whose legacy remains fiercely defended to this day. She didn't describe him yet. She didn't need to. She simply said that when people finally understand who he was behind closed doors, they will have to confront how much they were willing to ignore for the sake of entertainment. That single remark ignited speculation across the internet. Because if Goldie Hawn, one of Hollywood's most beloved figures, is finally willing to let go of decades of protection, then the next stories won't just tarnish reputations. They will rewrite history. And she hasn't finished talking. As Goldie's reflections continued to circulate, something shifted in the industry's response. At first, there was dismissal, the familiar reflex of calling it exaggeration, nostalgia, or selective memory. But then something more unsettling happened. People who had worked on those same sets in those same years began quietly backing her up. Not publicly, not with names, but with phrases like "that tracks," "I remember that energy," and "we were told not to talk." The silence started to feel coordinated, and that alone made her words heavier. Goldie began describing the emotional math everyone learned to do back then. Who could you offend safely? Who could you not? Which stars required flattery, which required fear, and which required complete invisibility. She explained how certain men were known for exploding without warning, not just verbally, but emotionally, reducing grown adults to trembling compliance, while everyone else pretended it was just part of the process. These men weren't punished for tantrums. They were rewarded: bigger budgets, more control, more power. Goldie said the cruelty wasn't incidental, it was functional. She recalled one set where a star's rage was so normalized that the crew prepared for it like weather. Schedules adjusted, extras warned, young actresses quietly pulled aside and told what not to say, how not to stand, when not to speak. The man's outbursts were explained away as dedication, passion, art. Goldie admitted that the first time she saw it, she thought she was overreacting. The fifth time she understood the truth, this behavior wasn't tolerated by accident. It was protected because it produced results. Then she turned to betrayal, and this is where her tone reportedly changed. Goldie spoke about how the most painful moments weren't always caused by the obvious villains. They came from people she thought were allies. Directors who sympathized privately but stayed silent publicly. Co-stars who warned her quietly but smiled beside abusers at premieres. Executives who said, "I understand," and then did nothing. She described realizing that silence wasn't neutral. It was participation. One story that struck listeners involved a young actress Goldie tried to help early in her career. She described advocating for her, praising her talent, pushing for her inclusion. The girl was bright, eager, and fearless. Too fearless. According to Goldie, the actress made the mistake of pushing back against inappropriate behavior, not loudly, just firmly. Within weeks, she stopped getting calls, roles vanished, meetings canceled, her name stopped circulating. Goldie said she never saw her again in the industry. No scandal, no explanation, just erasure. Goldie also reflected on how women were pitted against each other by design. Scarcity was weaponized. There were only so many roles, so many opportunities, so many seats at the table. That made competition vicious. Some women learned to survive by aligning themselves with power, even when that power was toxic. Goldie acknowledged this with empathy, not judgment. She understood the choices people made, but she also made it clear that the system thrived on that division. As these accounts spread, social media erupted into a frenzy of pattern recognition. Fans began compiling timelines. Old award speeches were rewatched with new eyes. Interviews that once felt awkward suddenly felt coded. Comment sections filled with people saying, "My grandmother worked on a set like that," or "My aunt warned me about one of these men years ago." What once seemed like isolated discomfort began as the conversation deepened. Industry veterans began quietly acknowledging that Goldie's account wasn't an outlier. It was representative. One anonymous producer was quoted saying that if people truly understood how many careers were sacrificed to protect a handful of powerful figures, the industry would never look the same again. Another said that the real tragedy wasn't just the abuse, but how thoroughly it was normalized. Then Goldie dropped another bombshell. She said there were moments when she was actively warned not to speak, not with threats, but with concern. Well-meaning people told her it wasn't safe, that she had too much to lose, that speaking up would make her a target. These warnings didn't come from villains. They came from people who cared about her. And that, she said, is how deep the fear ran. The internet latched onto one particular line she said during a quiet interview. Some people were protected because too many others depended on them. That sentence was dissected endlessly. Fans debated who she meant. Insiders knew immediately. Because dependence is the true currency of power, and in classic Hollywood, certain stars were too profitable to confront. By the end of these reflections, one thing was clear. Goldie wasn't exposing individuals for shock value. She was exposing a structure, a culture that rewarded silence and punished truth. A system where survival required compliance and where legends were built not just on talent, but on the suffering of those beneath them. And then she hinted again at the final figure, the one whose story she had never fully told. She said the reason she had waited so long wasn't fear anymore. It was timing. She wanted the world to be ready to hear it. Because this person wasn't just a star. They were an institution. And when their story comes into full light, it won't just challenge admiration. It will challenge the audience's willingness to look away. And with that, the conversation stopped feeling like reflection. It started feeling like a countdown. By the time Goldie reached what she called the last story, the room reportedly felt different, heavier. Not because of shock, but because of recognition. Everyone listening understood that this wasn't going to be another vague reflection about bad behavior or difficult personalities. This was the one she had avoided for decades, the one that made people stop interrupting, the one that explained why so many others had stayed silent for so long. Goldie began by describing how power changes when it's no longer loud. The earlier figures she'd alluded to ruled through fear, charm, or volatility. This one ruled through inevitability. Their presence was treated like gravity. You didn't challenge it, you adjusted to it. Goldie explained that this person never needed to raise their voice. The industry bent around them automatically. Scripts were rewritten. Casting choices reconsidered. People disappeared from projects without explanation, and no one ever asked why. What made this figure so dangerous, Goldie suggested, was that they were considered untouchable even in their own time. Not because of scandal, but because of reverence. They were framed as a pillar of Hollywood itself, someone whose absence would destabilize entire studios, whose approval could greenlight careers, whose displeasure could quietly end them. According to Goldie, this person understood that power perfectly and used it sparingly, which made it even more effective. She spoke about the psychological toll of working around someone like that. There were no rules written down, but everyone knew them. Don't contradict, don't shine too brightly, don't draw attention unless invited. Goldie recalled how young performers learned to dim themselves instinctively, shrinking their presence to avoid attracting notice. The cruelty wasn't in overt abuse. It was in the slow erosion of confidence, ambition, and voice. Goldie admitted that for years, she struggled to name what she felt in those rooms. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense. It was something colder, the understanding that you were always being measured, weighed, judged against an invisible standard you would never be allowed to see. And that judgment, once made, was permanent. There were no second chances with this person, no redemption arcs. You were either useful or gone. As she spoke, listeners began to realize why this story had stayed buried. Because accusing someone like this wasn't just risky, it felt almost sacrilegious. Goldie acknowledged that even now, people would accuse her of exaggeration, of bitterness, of misunderstanding genius. She anticipated the defenses before they were voiced. She said she'd heard them all before, for decades. That was part of the design. She then addressed the audience directly, in a way that reportedly stunned everyone present. She said the reason these figures were able to operate for so long wasn't just industry protection. It was public complicity. Fans didn't want their heroes complicated. Studios didn't want their investments questioned. And critics didn't want to dismantle the mythology they'd helped build. So the truth stayed fragmented. Whispers instead of accusations, patterns instead of names. Goldie made it clear she wasn't asking for retroactive punishment. Many of these figures were gone. Some had already been canonized beyond reproach. What she wanted, she said, was honesty. A willingness to look at the past without romantic filters. To admit that greatness and cruelty often coexisted, and that pretending otherwise only guaranteed repetition. She also revealed something deeply personal, that there were moments when she questioned her own memories. When being told that's just how it was, made her doubt her instincts. She said that gaslighting wasn't just interpersonal, it was institutional. When an entire industry insists something is normal, it takes years to recognize that it wasn't. That admission resonated widely online, especially with people from other industries who recognized the same patterns. As this part of Goldie's reflections spread, something unexpected happened. Younger actors began sharing their own experiences, not naming names, not accusing publicly, but acknowledging familiar dynamics, power imbalances, fear disguised as opportunity, silence framed as professionalism. The comments were cautious, but the resonance was unmistakable. The past wasn't as distant as people wanted to believe. Critics pushed back harder now. They accused Goldie of vague insinuations designed to damage legacies without accountability. Her response, relayed through close friends, was blunt. She said naming names was never the point. The point was understanding the system that made names unnecessary. When behavior is predictable across decades, across people, across studios, it stops being individual failure. It becomes cultural design. She also addressed the question everyone kept asking, why now? Why speak at 79? Goldie's answer was simple, because she no longer needed permission. Because the cost of silence had finally outweighed the cost of truth. And because she believed the audience had matured enough to hear complexity without needing villains or saints. The most powerful moment came near the end, when Goldie spoke about legacy. She said that classic Hollywood wasn't evil. It was brilliant, creative, transformative, but it was also deeply flawed. And pretending otherwise dishonors the people who were hurt within it. Loving art doesn't require loving everything about how it was made. In fact, she argued, real respect demands honesty. As the conversation drew to a close, Goldie returned to the number 6. 6 figures, 6 patterns of power. 6 ways the industry failed the people it claimed to celebrate. She didn't list them. She didn't summarize them neatly. She simply said that if people were paying attention, they already knew who fit which pattern. The truth, she implied, had been hiding in plain sight all along. The reaction online was immediate and intense. Some fans defended their idols fiercely. Others admitted discomfort. Many said they felt betrayed, not by Goldie, but by the stories they'd been sold. Film historians began revisiting archives. Journalists started asking harder questions. And quietly, very quietly, some industry veterans stopped dismissing these conversations as noise. The cliffhanger wasn't a name, it was a realization that the myths people grew up with were incomplete. That brilliance doesn't excuse harm. And that silence, no matter how long it lasts, eventually cracks. Goldie didn't promise more revelations. She didn't tease another interview. She didn't threaten exposure. She simply said that the truth doesn't need drama to survive. It just needs time. And now, finally, time is on its side. If you made it this far, you already understand something most people aren't ready to face yet. This isn't just a story, it's a turning point. Conversations like this don't surface often, And when they do, they get buried fast under denial, nostalgia, and outrage. That's why your engagement matters more than you think right now. Liking this video isn't just support, it tells the algorithm this conversation deserves oxygen. Commenting isn't just opinion, it keeps this discussion alive where silence once ruled. Subscribing isn't just a button, it's how you stay ahead of stories the industry hopes fade away before they're fully understood. If you've ever loved classic Hollywood, questioned a legacy, or felt that uneasy feeling when a story didn't quite add up, this channel is where those dots get connected. What comes next will go deeper, and the people paying attention now will be the ones who understand the full picture later. Don't wait until the narrative gets rewritten again. Don't let these stories disappear into remember when conversations years from now. This is one of those moments where being early matters, where missing the next video means missing context, clarity, and truth that won't be repeated the same way twice. Drop your thoughts in the comments, even if they're conflicted, especially if they're conflicted. That's how real conversations start. Hit subscribe so you're not catching up after the fact. And turn on notifications, because when the next layer of this story breaks, it won't come with a warning. This isn't gossip for nostalgia's sake. This is history being re-examined, and you're either part of the conversation or watching it happen without you.